Hey you, still awake? Phone glowing in your face like a cursed relic. Yeah, same. Welcome back to Medieval Melatonin, your soft-lit portal to the past. If you're new here, this channel's all about history for sleep. No shouting, no jump cuts. Just the hum of old stories told slow. So if I help you unwind, or better yet, knock you out cold, drop a like or hit subscribe. When you wake up, I'll still be here. So will the 14th century. And before you drift off, tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? What time is it for you? I always find it calming, even magical, to imagine drifting off in faraway places. Midnight in Warsaw, 2 a.m. in Sao Paulo, a dorm in Seoul, a cabin in the Rockies. But tonight, we're going somewhere even further, to a world that's slower, simpler, and a little smokier around the edges. We're following the flicker of a red lantern, the pluck of a lute, the rustle of silk and whispers. We're going to visit a medieval brothel. Now don't worry, this is still YouTube. There's nothing explicit here. No shock, no sleaze. Just a peek at the lives lived behind the shutters. The women who worked, the men who paid, the laws, the lies, the loneliness, and yes, the laughter too. So dim the lights, let the day melt away. Let's begin. The city was different at night. By day, the streets of Paris or London smelled of wet straw, rotting fish, and too many people packed too close together. But at night, there was music. Candlelight danced behind shuttered windows. The clop of hooves gave way to the softer crunch of boots on cobble. The smell of smoke and wine wafted from taverns whose doors stayed open long after curfew. And if you were a traveller, maybe a merchant with coin to burn or a clerk with none, but a longing to forget your vows, you'd follow the sound of laughter. You'd pass inns and houses, men relieving themselves in gutters, drunkards crooning ballads. Then you'd see it, a red lantern above a door. This wasn't just any house. It was a house of women, of pleasure, of profit, a brothel. But this wasn't Las Vegas. This was medieval Europe. The church didn't approve. The magistrates turned a blind eye or collected their cut. And the people, well, they had opinions. Loud ones, but also needs. Needs that didn't vanish just because the priest wagged his finger. So you step closer. Maybe you're in Southwark across the Thames from London proper, a district notorious for bear-baiting pits, dice dens, and houses like this. Or maybe it's Bruges, Frankfurt, or Avignon. The names change, but the glow of that red lantern, that's constant. You feel the tension of the city ease as you cross the threshold. Outside, you are someone, a baker, a barber, a butcher, a bishop's servant. Inside, you're anonymous. The door opens, and a voice greets you, not with shame or scorn, but with a wink. A coin is expected, but judgment, not here. You've just stepped into a medieval brothel. What follows is a place caught between two worlds. On one hand, vice and vulnerability. On the other, laughter, silk, perfume, and power. Because these houses weren't just places for men to sneak into. They were often owned and run by women. They paid taxes. They formed informal guilds. They bribed local officials. In some cities, they were even licensed by the crown, but that doesn't mean they were safe, or glamorous, or even clean. Tonight, though, you don't think about that. You see the flicker of a candlelit hallway. You hear a lute plucking softly in the background. You hear the rustle of skirts, the creak of a stair, the pop of a cork. So how did this world work? What happened inside? Who were the women behind the rouge and ribbons? Let's find out. The first thing you'd notice wasn't the women. It was the building itself. A medieval brothel could be grand or grimy, depending on the clientele it served. In cities like Paris or Toulouse, high-end establishments looked almost like upper-class homes, with wooden balconies, decorative signs, and even small courtyards. But in smaller towns or seedier districts, picture a smoky room above a tavern, straw-strewn floors, and a door that never fully closed. But always there were signals. The most common, a red lantern hung above the door or in the window, hence the term red light district, which traces its roots to this very medieval practice. Other signs included ivy garlands, open shutters with fabric blowing provocatively in the night air, or, if the city had legalized brothels, an actual emblem from the town council certifying it as an officially tolerated den of sin. Some cities even required workers to wear distinctive clothing in public. In Vienna, for instance, prostitutes had to wear a yellow veil. In London, they were forbidden from dressing in anything but striped hoods or specific colors. The aim? To mark them, to warn others. But in a world without Tinder, dating apps, or even privacy, those marks also served as advertisements. Step inside, and you were greeted not by moans or moody lighting, but by a businesswoman. The brothel keeper, often a former worker herself, was called the abbess or the mayor, depending on the region. And make no mistake, this was her domain. She handled the money, negotiated with city officials, bribed the bailiff when needed, and kept the peace. Behind her, the common room, dimly lit by rushlights or oil lamps. In high-end establishments, there might be music, flutes, harps, the occasional drunken lute player. There'd be wine, bad wine, usually, sometimes spiced, sometimes watered down. There might be food too, cold meats, stale bread, dried fruit, enough to keep a guest lingering. And lingering was the point. Brothels weren't always wham-bam affairs. In fact, in many cases, they doubled as taverns or bathhouses. A customer might come in, drink a bit, play dice with other patrons, chat up the girls, and then, eventually, retire upstairs, if he could afford it. In some cities, such as medieval Cologne, brothels were overseen by the city itself. The women were considered quasi-official service workers. They were granted protection in theory, taxed in reality, and required to undergo regular medical inspections sporadically. A kind of state-sanctioned vice. Other towns were less organized. In Florence, prostitution was legal, but heavily surveilled. In London, tolerated but technically illegal. In Avignon, home to the popes during their exile from Rome, the brothels operated in the shadow of the cathedral, and nobody blinked. As you moved deeper into the house, you'd see the girls, or women, rather, lounging near the fire, weaving garlands, sipping wine, or laughing with a customer. Their faces painted with homemade rouge, their eyes lined with soot, their bodies perfumed with herbs or oils. Some wore low-cut bodices or sheer chemises. Others dressed in costume, nuns, noble women, even biblical figures. A medieval form of role-play. It wasn't all sensuality and smiles, though. You might also see a girl staring blankly at the wall, a man shouting in a corner, a younger worker cleaning blood from a cot upstairs. This was a job, one of the few available to women on the margins. Some chose it, others were pushed. Others had no choice at all. But for tonight, the candles flicker, the music plays, and a hand slips into yours, inviting you up the stairs. She tells you her name is Isabeau, or Johann, or maybe something more exotic, Melisande, say, borrowed from a romance. Whether it's her real name or not, you don't ask. You ask where she's from. She says Paris, or Rouen, or a village no one's heard of, swallowed by mud and debt years ago. How did she get here? The answers vary. Some were orphaned, some were disowned, others were simply poor, a few were sold by their families. And a rare handful. They chose this life. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to eat, to survive, or to get out from under the thumb of a violent husband or a cruel overlord. In many cities, women in this trade fell into loose categories. There were the independent workers, who operated from rented rooms or behind taverns, often at greater personal risk, but with more autonomy. Then there were those working in licensed brothels, where the madam took a cut, and the city turned a blind eye, so long as taxes were paid and trouble was kept to a minimum. Then there were the high-end courtesans, more common in places like Venice or Avignon, who entertained noblemen, scholars, even bishops. These women might be literate, they might compose poetry, play instruments, engage in philosophical banter. They dressed in silks, wore jewelry gifted by patrons, and operated not just from brothels, but from private salons or discreet apartments. They were, in a sense, the medieval elite of the sex trade. But they were the exception. Most women in brothels lived upstairs, sharing cramped rooms with straw beds, tallow candles, and thin blankets. They worked long hours, entertained rude customers, dealt with drunkards, gamblers, thieves. They had to clean up vomit, hide bruises, patch up their own wounds with wine-soaked rags and prayer. And yet they laughed. They gossiped. They danced together when no one was watching. They formed strange little families. The madam, harsh but maternal. The older girls, weary but wise. The younger ones, wide-eyed and still clinging to the idea that they might one day marry, or escape, or simply stop. Some cities required regular medical inspections, not out of concern for the women, but to protect the customers. In places like Lubeck or Vienna, officials called syphilis examiners would check the workers weekly. If they were found to have a disease, they were sometimes banned from working until they recovered, with no pay in the meantime. Birth control was rudimentary, herbal concoctions, sponges soaked in vinegar, prayers whispered to saints who looked the other way. Abortions, illegal, dangerous, and whispered about in alleys. Pregnancy happened often. Children were born and either sent to foundling homes, raised communally, or, in the worst cases, abandoned. Still, the job had its peculiar perks. Some women earned enough to buy their freedom, to open taverns, or to retire into less precarious lives. A few, rare and sharp, became wealthy. Others aged into the role of madam, using what they'd learned to protect the next generation. But most, they disappeared. No grave markers, no elegies, just records in city rolls. Agnes, fined for soliciting, or Marta, died of fever in the brothel quarter. And yet, for a few hours, to the man sitting in the candlelight across from her, Isabeau is not invisible. She's a queen, a saint, a fantasy. Until the candle burns out. So what actually happened in a medieval brothel? It depended on the customer and what they could pay. A wealthy merchant might expect more than a quick tumble. He might want wine, a private room, a hot bath. Yes, bathhouses were often linked to brothels, and someone to sing to him, pour his drink, listen to his stories, pretend he was important. It wasn't just about lust. It was about fantasy, about being seen. But for the poor man with only a few pennies, no music, no bath, no privacy, a creaky cot, a candle stub, and 10 minutes before the madam knocks wants to signal time's up. That's if things go smoothly. But things didn't always go smoothly. Arguments broke out. Drunken brawls erupted. Some men refused to pay. Others grew violent. Brothels hired guards, or kept large dogs for protection. Some towns required brothel keepers to maintain peace under threat of heavy fines. If a man died inside, the house could be shut down. Or worse, the workers blamed for murder or witchcraft. And then there were the diseases. They didn't have a name for syphilis until the 15th century, but venereal diseases absolutely existed. They were called the burning, the drip, or sometimes just the curse. Treatments ranged from herbal poultices to prayers to mercury salves, which often made things worse. The church predictably disapproved. Officially, prostitution was a sin, a mortal one. Brothels were condemned in sermons, blamed for floods, fires, and plagues. But unofficially, the church tolerated them, even profited from them. In Avignon, when the popes fled Rome and set up court in the 14th century, they did so within walking distance of a thriving red light district. The Bishop of Winchester owned brothels in Southwark, London, and collected rent from them. It was the oldest double standard in Christendom. To reconcile the contradiction, medieval theologians crafted a rationale. Certain vices were seen as a lesser evil. Better for men to seek release in discreet, regulated settings than to risk compromising the innocence of a maiden, or worse, stray into what the church viewed as more unnatural paths. Even Saint Augustine warned that eliminating such outlets entirely could unloose the passions of men. So long as it remained hidden, taxed, supervised, kept quiet, it was tolerated. Barely. But things didn't always stay in their place. When plague swept the land, these shadowed quarters were shut. When fiery preachers like Savonarola gained sway, they were condemned and destroyed. And when reformers came, Lutherans, Calvinists, and others, the districts were purged, either forcibly closed or pushed deeper underground. They bore the brunt, fined, imprisoned, paraded through the streets as examples, even if they'd paid their dues. Even if the same officials now punishing them had once been their patrons, it was a precarious life. Whatever protection they had could vanish with the next sermon, the next riot, the next moral crackdown. But the risk wasn't only theirs. A nobleman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time could be ruined, or worse. Whispers told of men lured in, robbed, humiliated, left to stumble home in shame. In some cities, it was rumored these places doubled as spy networks, gathering secrets, whispered behind closed doors, and selling them to rivals. And yet, people still came. However, in many towns, you didn't walk straight into a brothel, you bathed first. That wasn't out of courtesy. It was policy. In cities like Nuremberg, bathhouses and brothels were often physically linked, sometimes even sharing a building. A kind of medieval pre-game ritual. Imagine it. You strip down in a warm, steamy room of painted tiles and wooden tubs. Attendants bring you a towel, maybe offer a bit of lavender soap, if you can afford it. A bucket of hot water is poured over your head, sluicing away the city's grime. If you're lucky, you sit in a heated pool with other patrons, sipping spiced wine while steam rises around you. The bathhouse was its own strange liminal space, half spa, half social club, with flirtation thick in the air. Some men came just for the soak, others had more in mind. At times, the bath attendant was the same girl who'd later walk you to a back room. These houses had rules, posted ones even. In Strasbourg, a 14th century ordinance laid them out, clearly: no fighting, no drunkenness, no forcing yourself on a worker, no weapons in the water. In theory, at least. They also had hierarchies. The cleaner the bathhouse, the more expensive the woman. The more expensive the woman, the more elaborate the fantasy. She might greet you as a noblewoman, or a Roman empress, or even, as absurd as it sounds, a figure from scripture. These weren't just acts of seduction, they were performances. The line between role play and reality was thin, and often deliberately blurred. But the baths carried risk too. Warm water meant open pores. If disease was present, it spread quickly. And cleanliness? A luxury, not a guarantee. Even the warmest waters couldn't wash away poverty, or the fact that many workers had no access to physicians, midwives, or even proper rest between clients. Still, to a customer, it all felt elevated. The music, the haze, the closeness of naked skin. The church hated this. It wasn't just carnal, it was theatrical. A threat to morality, not because it was hidden, but because it wasn't. Because people laughed in the steam. Because candles lit the corners. because even the sinners seemed to feel something like joy. And so bathhouses were regulated harder, pushed farther from cathedrals, sometimes shut entirely after outbreaks of plague. But the link between steam and sin lingered. Even centuries later, in cities like Amsterdam or Prague, red light quarters would keep the bathhouse spirit alive, offering comfort as a prelude to intimacy and anonymity wrapped in warmth. For a traveller in the 14th century, it was part of the ritual, part of the price, and part of the story that almost never made it into the chronicles. The candle is nearly gone. You button your tunic, fasten your belt. The girl, Johann, Isabeau, whoever she was, gives a half smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. You thank her. You're not sure why. Downstairs, the room is quieter now. A few men still linger by the hearth, slurring songs. The madam gives you a practiced nod. She's already forgotten your name. You step back out into the street. The air is colder than you remembered. Damp! The kind that sinks into your bones and reminds you that tomorrow the city will wake again. Merchants will haggle. Priests will preach. Rats will skitter in the alleys. And you, well, you'll return to your station in life. But for a few hours, you weren't a tanner or a failed apprentice or just another face in the crowd. You were a man with a secret, a memory. Maybe even a lie to tell your friends. But the brothel? It stays. The medieval brothel was never just a place of pleasure. It was a mirror. A contradiction. A building that sat between the sacred and the profane, tolerated and condemned, hidden yet central to urban life. They served as economic engines, employing not just workers but cooks, cleaners, musicians, guards. They acted as social spaces, places where classes blurred, where bishops rubbed shoulders with blacksmiths. In a world of rigid hierarchy, brothels were one of the few spaces where power shifted, even if only for a night. They were also places of extraordinary human cost. Behind the silk and music lay stories of coercion, abuse, disease, and loss. The workers were disposable. When they aged, they vanished. When they resisted, they were punished. When they got sick, they were buried without a name. And yet, they left a trace. City archives are full of brothel records, tax rolls, complaints, arrests, leases. In some cities, you can still walk the same alleys, see the same crooked beams, find the carvings etched into the lintels, ivy leaves, chalices, winged hearts.